A very good evening to one and all present here. On behalf of the Department of English, Ulveria College, I welcome you all once again on this second session of day 2 of the web lecture series organized by Department of English in collaboration with IQAC Ulveria College. Today, for this second session, we have with us Dr. Shibujit Sengupta from Burdwan University. We welcome you, sir. It is an honor and privilege for us to
Good
have
evening.
you amongst us. And thank you. We are grateful to you, sir, that you have taken time out from your such busy schedule to impart your knowledge towards our students. It is a privilege for us, it is a privilege for our students to listen to your lecture. Welcome, sir. Welcome once again on behalf of my entire department. So, in the morning, we were in the 20th century, learning about modern poetry and T.S. Eliot. Let's just click the rewind button and go back to the Elizabethan era and learn about Shakespearean sonnets. I hope our students will enjoy your lecture and will learn a lot from your insightful thoughts. I would request my colleague Ananda ma'am to introduce our speaker, our esteemed speaker, to the audience. Over to you, ma'am. Ananda ma'am, please.
Thank you, Bashab ma'am. Um, Good evening, one and all present here, my dear students and my dear colleagues and Dr. Subhajit Sengupta. We are really happy to have you with us today. And as Bashab host said that in the morning we really had a brainstorming session on Eliot and modernism. And now it's time to go back in time to the Renaissance era, almost in the manner of a psychic voyage, to learn and discuss more on our beloved poet and playwright Shakespeare. Although I think it would be a bit incorrect to confine him to the Elizabethan era because he is beyond time and he is beyond space. So that is why he's so relevant today that we love reading him. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Shibujit Sengupta, our valuable resource person who has really taken out his time for us to enlighten the students and also ask the faculty members about him. Dr. Sengupta began his career in the academia in 1999 and is presently an associate professor and head in the Department of English and Cultural Studies, the University of Burdwan. He specializes in Shakespeare and the European Renaissance, and his doctoral thesis, for which he received his PhD degree in 2006, is titled Genre and Meaning in Shakespeare's Histories. He is a member of the Shakespeare Society of India and has earlier been a member of the British Shakespearean Association. His other interests include 18th century British literature and culture and postmodern literature and culture. Besides, Dr. Sengupta loves poetry, theatre, sports, painting, and photography. Welcome, sir, and thank you once again for being a part of this. And I hope our students will enjoy this lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ananda. And I'm really grateful to the organizers of this lecture and to the Department of English, Ulveria College, and to the college itself for having invited me. It's a privilege to be with the members of the faculty and with the students of this college. Yes, I have been very busy, very busy over the last few days, still am, and will be so for the next few days till the end of the week and maybe beyond that. Because as you all know, we have to organize our final semester examinations in October and possibly declare the results very soon after that. And this is keeping my colleagues and me in the department in our university occupied all day long, and we hardly have time for anything else. But this is a commitment I had made several days ago when Shundeep first called me, and I really could not let him down and let the department down. And secondly, I'm not only interested in Shakespeare, but Shakespeare has been since a long time now, a bit of a passion for me. And so whenever there's an opportunity to speak on Shakespeare, I generally tend not to refuse if I can help it. So yes, we'll be for how many minutes? I'm sorry, I haven't asked you that. For how many minutes must I talk? For how long? Hello? Could any one of the organizers let me know how long I may speak?
Sir, you can speak for about an hour and a half, if that's okay with you.
I'll speak for an hour, all right?
Yeah, that's
And
fine
then we
as
can
well.
reserve some time for discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, sir.
All right. You're most welcome. I'll be talking on Shakespeare's sonnets, and I'll be focusing on the sonnets that the students have as part of their syllabus, and those are sonnets 18 and 116. Very popular sonnets, and I remember that when we were undergraduates at college, we studied those sonnets as well, in addition to Sonnet 73, which is also very popular. Now, before we begin to speak specifically about these two sonnets, I'd like to spend some time talking about the sequence of sonnets that Shakespeare wrote. But before we even go into that, I'll talk a little about the genre of the sonnet itself. It was, as most of you know, a very fashionable genre of poetry during the Renaissance. It had its origins in Renaissance Italy, and it was a new kind of poetry that was emerging during the Renaissance. Aristotle had spoken about the lyric, he had spoken about the epic, but he hadn't spoken about the sonnet, had he? No. And it's hardly surprising that he shouldn't have spoken about the sonnet, because there was no sonnet at the time that Aristotle was writing. There was no sonnet till the late medieval period, when Dante began to write sonnets. And most of the sonnets that Dante wrote in the 13th century were about a lady that he loved, a lady called Beatrice. Petrarch, who is one of the pioneers of humanist philosophy during the Italian Renaissance, or should we say during the European Renaissance, because from Italy, the Renaissance spread to some of the other countries of Europe, including England, which was at that time, until very recently, a part of Europe. And Petrarch, indeed, not only is one of the earliest sonneteers of Renaissance Italy, but he's also one of the pioneers of the philosophy that we call Renaissance humanism, a philosophy which assumes man to be of central importance and to be supreme in the created world. And as E.M.W. Tilliard, a famous writer on the Renaissance and on Shakespeare, has told us, we could construct a certain chain of being where all the creatures of the world and some inanimate objects like the metals could be arranged in an hierarchical order, in order of descending significance, with man at the top and the lowest, the basest metals at the bottom. And this Tilliard called the great chain of being. This idea of the great chain of being has its origin in the Renaissance philosophy about the greatness, the supremacy of man. But the supremacy of man is an idea that goes back to the classical age. Now, we are not going to talk about the supremacy of man in today's discussion. We'll be talking about the sonnets. I was only trying to point out to you what we mean by humanist philosophy. We mean a lot of other things as well by humanist philosophy, but this is the central argument of Renaissance humanism or Renaissance humanist philosophy, that man is supreme. Man is capable of rational thought. Man is capable of taking decisions. Man is capable of making judgments. Man is his own maker. He can fashion himself. He can mold himself in certain ways to become a certain kind of person. So what man would do would depend on what he wants to do, what he decides to do, what he makes up his mind to do. And this is why in Renaissance drama, if you look at English Renaissance tragedies, for example, character becomes so important. Free will becomes so important. Because man is no longer a plaything, a puppet in the hands of fate, as in the older Greek and Roman tragedies, at least most of them. So we talk about character and the importance of character. We talk about errors of judgment. Of course, Aristotle also had spoken of errors of judgment when he was discussing Greek tragedy. But there, in Greek tragedy, the errors of judgment are generally committed in states of ignorance. Generally, there could be the odd exception, but generally, as in the case of Oedipus, who kills his father and marries his mother. This is an error of judgment. But when he makes this mistake, he is not aware of what he's doing. He only learns later of the terrible nature of the mistake that he had made. But take, for instance, Macbeth's killing of Duncan. He kills Duncan in full knowledge of the fact that he is committing a crime against a guest. Look at the speech that Macbeth is given in the beginning of Act 1, Scene 7. It's the speech which begins with, "If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well, it were done quickly." He knows that he will be punished for what he is doing. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, he says. We have to face God's judgment. He knows who Duncan is and what he must do. He says, "I should behave like his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself." And he knows what the repercussions, what the effects will be of the murder of Duncan. A pity like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. And he knows what is driving him to this crime. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. And so what do we make of it? What we make of it is that Macbeth commits the crime in full knowledge of what he is doing and in full knowledge of the consequences of what he is doing. And the fact that Shakespeare should give Macbeth the space within which Macbeth should make such an utterance to whom? To the audience, shows that he is the kind of man that the Renaissance humanist philosophy celebrated. I'm not talking about Renaissance humanist philosophy celebrating a man who would commit a crime, but I'm talking of Renaissance humanist philosophy celebrating a man who could think rationally, take decisions, who was capable of judgment. Now, if that judgment were a wrong judgment, the person would suffer. But the important thing for the humanists was that a person could take decisions and offer judgments. They could be good or bad, right or wrong, but that was secondary. Their very capacity for taking decisions, making judgments, for rational thinking, made man superior to all other creatures. Now, why am I saying this? Of course, I branched off from Petrarch. I started by saying that Petrarch was one of the founding fathers, one of the pioneers of humanist philosophy during the Renaissance, and that is what led me to talk about Renaissance humanism and then to Macbeth. But there's another reason why I've been speaking of this. If I'm to come to Sonnet 18, I have to pass through the first 17 sonnets and then come to Sonnet 18. And to those of you who are reading Shakespeare's sonnets, Sonnets 18 and 116, which are prescribed for your study in the syllabus, I'll strongly recommend that you read some of the other important sonnets too, particularly the sonnets that precede Sonnet 18, that is Sonnets 1 to 17, Sonnet 19, the one that immediately follows Sonnet 18, and the sonnets immediately before and after Sonnet 116, so that you may place the sonnets that are prescribed for your study in their proper contexts. Of course, if you could read all the 154 sonnets, that will be wonderful, but I'm not sure if you'll find time for that. If you do find time for that, then read the entire sequence. Now, this is because the entire sequence unfolds a story. You cannot expect to read chapter 7, chapter 29, and chapter 33 of a novel which has 42 chapters, and then expect to understand the whole novel. And you will not understand those 3 individual chapters as well. At least you will not understand them as perfectly as you would do if you could read the whole novel. And so if you could read the entire sequence, you would understand Sonnets 18 and 116 better than you would if you read only those 2 sonnets. But at least you could try reading the sonnets that precede Sonnet 18 and the one that comes after that, Sonnet 19, and the 2 or 3 sonnets immediately before 116 and after 116. And I'll strongly recommend that you do that. Now, in the first 17 sonnets, the poet, I will not say Shakespeare. I will not say Shakespeare because it has not been proved that the sonnets are autobiographical. So let us not take the speaker in the sonnets to be Shakespeare. Let us not say, for example, that at the start of Sonnet 18, Shakespeare wonders whether he should compare the young man's beauty to the beauty of a summer's day. Let us say the speaker or the poet. And this poet that we are speaking of is like the narrator in a short story or a novel. And we know that the narrator is always distinguished from the author, unless, of course, we are looking at an autobiography where the narrator and the author merge into one. But that's different. In the case of an autobiographical poem like Wordsworth's Prelude, again, the poet in the poem, the speaker in the poem, and the real-life poet, William Wordsworth, are one. But we all know that the Prelude is an autobiographical poem, and Wordsworth himself made no secret of it. But we're not sure about Shakespeare. We don't know, for example, if Shakespeare really, in real life, was so passionately fond of a young male friend who is the subject of the first 126 sonnets. And we don't know if he really had such a male companion, who that male companion was. Similarly, we know hardly anything about the Dark Lady, who is the subject of sonnets 127 to 152. And so I'll stop short of saying that the sonnets are autobiographical. Wordsworth said of Shakespeare's sonnets that with his sonnets, Shakespeare unlocked his heart. I'll say that the speaker in these sonnets unlocks his heart. Now, I'm not sure if the speaker is Shakespeare. Shakespeare could have created the persona of a speaker, of a poet figure who speaks in the poems. Now, what was a sonnet? A poem of 14 lines. But if I ask you to write a poem, and if you write 14 lines and find it very difficult to proceed after that, if no thoughts come to your mind, and if you can't write beyond the 14th line, you can't say that you have written a sonnet. A sonnet has to have certain other features. Some formal characteristics, for example, the rhyme scheme. Now, the sonnet originated in Italy. Dante was the earliest sonneteer of some renown. There could have been minor sonneteers around him, but we don't really know much about them. Dante was the first important sonneteer, but of greater importance was Francesco Petrarch. Petrarch, like Dante, who wrote about his lady love Beatrice, Petrarch wrote about his lady love, Laura, Laura. Now, both Dante and Petrarch used a certain rhyme scheme and a certain kind of pattern of development of the argument. in the poems they wrote. A set of 8 lines called the octave was followed by another set of lines, a set of 6 lines called the sestet. So we had 8 lines first and then 6 lines, and the argument proceeded in one direction through the first 8 lines, and then at the start of the sestet, that is at the start of the 9th line, there would be a word technically called volta, V-O-L-T-A, in Italian. The word was borrowed from Italian Renaissance music, and it was used to denote a sudden, abrupt twist in the musical composition. Here at the start of the 9th line, we have a twist, a sudden, abrupt turnaround in the argument. And so we take the term over from music and apply it to the sonnets. And the first word of the sestet is called the volta. In most of these sonnets, the first word in the Italian sonnets is the Italian equivalent of English words such as but, yet, still, I do such and such things. The first 8 lines, and then the 9th line begins with still I would not do this, or but I would not do this. The first 8 lines could be saying, well, Laura is beautiful and she's this and that, and then the 9th line could begin by saying, but I will not go near her. So there's a sudden twist. And that is how the argument takes place. It's twofold. 8 lines, 6 lines. And the rhyme scheme is in keeping with this structure of argument. The first 8 lines rhyme like this: A, B, A, B. Very sorry. A, B, B, A. A, B, B, A. And then C, the first 8 lines, A, B, B, A, B, B, A. That's the first 8 lines. And then we have C, D, E, C, D, E. In certain cases, it could be C, D, C, C, D, C. And so you realize that we needed 3 rhyming words for the first A. So since there are 4 A's, 3 further B's for the first B. A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And then C, D, C, C, D, C. If it was C, D, C, C, D, C, we would require 4 C's and 2 D's. If it were C, D, E, C, D, E, we would require 2 C's, 2 D's, and 2 E's. And Petrarch is called, the kind of sonnet that Petrarch wrote, even if sonnets of the kind that Petrarch wrote were written by other sonneteers, these sonnets were still called the Petrarchan sonnet, because Petrarch was the most famous practitioner of this kind of sonnet. So anyone who wrote in the manner of Petrarch was called a Petrarchan sonneteer, and the sonnets were called Petrarchan sonnets or Italian sonnets. And this is, of course, with some unfairness to Dante, because Dante had written in the same form before Petrarch, but Petrarch was more famous as a sonneteer and was more widely imitated, not only in Italy, but in other countries as well, such as France, and then in England, in Spain, but particularly in France and England. Now, in England, the Renaissance started towards the end of the 15th century, some would say 1485, when the Tudor dynasty was established, or some would say at the start of the 16th century for the sake of greater convenience. Now, we cannot really place ages in the history of literature or ages in history within watertight compartments, because characteristics of one age flow into the next age and merge with the emerging characteristics of the next age. So this is roughly the time the Renaissance came into England, the early 16th century or the late 15th century. And the earliest poets in England to imitate Petrarch and write Petrarchan sonnets in English were Thomas Watt and Henry Howard, whose names you will find in any book on the history of English literature. Henry Howard was also called Surrey because he was the Earl of Surrey. And earls and dukes were sometimes referred to by the names of the places that they governed. So since the Earl of Surrey governed Surrey, he was sometimes simply called Surrey. Now, they wrote in the Petrarchan form, but then the Earl of Surrey, Henry Howard, realized at one point of time that the English language of that period, which was a slightly different language with fewer words in the vocabulary than there are now, the English language did not have as many rhyming words as the Italian language had. So in every poem, it became difficult to find 4 A's and 4 B's. 2 A's were easier to find, 2 B's and 2 C's and 2 E's, 2 F's, and that makes it 12 lines, and then 2 G's to make it 14 lines. This meant that although there would be a greater variety of rhymes, one would have to look for fewer rhyming words to rhyme with one particular rhyming word. So if there was a line ending with the rhyming sound A, one would have to look for only one more A rather than for 3 more A's. Now, so the English rhyme scheme was invented by Henry Howard when he had this very important realization. And the kind of rhyme scheme that he invented was A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Now, this sort of rhyme scheme implied that there were now 4 parts rather than 2 parts in the sonnet. Earlier in the Italian sonnet, there were 2 parts, ABBA, ABBA, 1 part, 8 lines, and then CDC, CDC, or CDE, CDE, the next 6 lines. But here, we now had AB, AB, the first part, the first set of 4 lines, or the first quatrain. CD, CD, the second quatrain, EF, EF, the third quatrain, and then there had to be 2 more lines. So a couplet rhyming GG to finish the sonnet. 3 quatrains and a couplet. But if that were so, if there were 4 parts to the sonnet now, the argument also had to develop in 4 stages. If you read Sonnet 73, or if you read Sonnet 116, or if you read some of the other sonnets there in the sequence, most of them, you will find that the arguments in Shakespeare's sonnets develops in 4 stages. The second quatrain takes forward the argument of the first quatrain. The third takes forward the argument of the second, and then the contentions, the arguments of the first 3 quatrains are either affirmed by the couplet or resisted, sometimes denied by the couplet. The couplets sometimes affirm the contentions or the arguments of the first 3 quatrains, and sometimes they resist those arguments or even deny those arguments. When they deny those arguments, the contentions of the first 12 lines or the first 3 quatrains, we have at the start of the couplet something like the Italian Volta, which in the Italian sonnet was at the start of the sestet or at the start of the 9th line. Here, sometimes we have a similar word at the start of the 13th line, which is the beginning of the couplet. Not always, sometimes, in cases where the arguments of the first 12 lines or the first 3 quatrains are resisted or denied. All right, so we come to Shakespeare now, and Shakespeare was arguably the greatest of the Renaissance sonnetiers in England, and possibly anywhere. Some would argue that Petrarch was a greater sonneteer. The French are reluctant to admit the greatness of Shakespeare because, in any case, they are reluctant to admit the greatness of English culture, but that's another story. But there is a certain unanimity among literary scholars that Shakespeare was the greatest sonneteer of the Renaissance, of the European Renaissance. All right, whatever that could be. We don't really want to enter that debate about who the greatest sonneteer was, because there's no point in doing that. It's subject to opinion. After Wat and Surrey, there was a lull in sonneteering in England, a period when drama began to become gradually popular. The first public playhouse, called the Theatre, was built by James Burbage in 1576. Playwriting became very popular, the university wits, and then Shakespeare. But in the 1580s, long after the early part of that century when Surrey and Watt had been actively writing sonnets, long after that, several decades after that, towards the end of that century, the 1580s, sonnets once again began to become popular. Now, English poets such as Spenser and Philip Sidney and Michael Drayton, Samuel Daniel, they wrote collections of sonnets and published them as books. Daniel's collection was called Delia. Michael Drayton's collection of sonnets was called Idea's Mirror. Sidney's collection of sonnets was called Astrophel and Stella. Spenser's collection of sonnets was called Amoretti. Shakespeare's collection of sonnets, which was published a little later in 1609, was simply called Sonnets. Shakespeare wrote the sonnets between 1592 and 1598. He was born in 1564, so he was between 28 and 34 during the time that he was writing his sonnets. And this was before he had written the great tragedies, Macbeth and Hamlet and Lear and Othello, or even Twelfth Night, for example, which he wrote towards the beginning of the 17th century, around 1600. And of course, The Tempest, another play that many students read, was written much later, towards the end of Shakespeare's career. This was then the early part of Shakespeare's career, beginning from the early part of his career and flowing in to this middle part of his career, 1592 to 1598. And Shakespeare was between 28 and 34. And he couldn't have really thought of himself as old and on the verge of death if he were only between 28 and 34. If you look at some of the sonnets, sonnets 71, 72, 73, he addresses the young man and says he is about to die, he's old. In Sonnet 73, he compares himself to the autumn season. He compares himself to the evening twilight. He compares himself to a fire that is about to be extinguished. And these images become images of old age, looking forward to death. Between 28 and 34, Shakespeare certainly couldn't have been looking forward to death. He wasn't seriously ill, we know from his biographers, during these years. There was nothing really to make him believe that he would die. And so, once again, I repeat that I find the argument that the sonnets are autobiographical very untenable, very unconvincing. Now, this young man that the poet addresses in the first 126 sonnets obviously is handsome, but he is a bachelor, he hasn't married. We don't know who he was, or whether Shakespeare really had someone in mind. There have been speculations about the identity of the young man, but then there's no point in going into those speculations. On the title page of the sonnets, published in 1609, we find a dedication. And the sonnets seem to be dedicated to a mysterious man called W.H. And just as there have been speculations about the identity of the young man of the first 126 sonnets, there have also been speculations, numerous in fact, about the identity of W.H., the person to whom the sonnets are dedicated. Some suppose that it's William Herbert, his initials. And William Herbert was the Earl of Pembroke. Some suppose that it was Henry Wriothesley, W-R-I-O-T-H-S-L-E-Y, with the initials reversed. Henry Wriothesley, and here W-H. So there's a reversal of initials, possibly, if it was indeed Henry Wriothesley. And he was the Earl of Southampton. Some believe, and this is quite ridiculous, that W.H. means William himself, and that Shakespeare was dedicating the sequence to his own self. But I don't think that's very reasonable. Now, of course, this W.H. must have been a person in real life, but for some reason Shakespeare wanted to keep the identity secret. We don't know what the reason for that could be. Or maybe he was only teasing his readers. But so far as the young man in the poems is concerned, some would say that the young man is the same person as W.H. If W.H. was a real person, I think he was, then Shakespeare must have found this person, W.H., worthy of being the young man that is celebrated in the first 126 sonnets. But this young man could be simply a construct of Shakespeare's imagination. And W.H., if he were a real person, if he were William Herbert or Henry Wriothesley, of course he could be different from the young man in the sonnets. I think, it's my conjecture, but don't rely ever on conjectures. But I'll just let you in on my personal opinion. I think that the young man in the sonnets is not W.H. W.H. is the person to whom the sonnets are dedicated. And the young man, I think, is as much a construct of Shakespeare's imagination as the speaker in the poems. Now, we're not talking about the Dark Lady today because neither of these two sonnets is a Dark Lady sonnet. But there have been speculations about the identity of the Dark Lady as well. Some say it's a lady called Emilia Lemia. Some say it's a lady called Black Luce. Some say it's another lady called Mary Fitton. Some say it's a lady called Jacqueline Field. And there have been several other contenders for the Dark Lady besides the names that I've just pronounced. Sonnet 127, which begins the Dark Lady section, is a strange poem because it's a poem of only 26 lines. It's a poem of only 12 lines. This is strange, but it's also significant because Shakespeare was trying to suggest that I'm sorry, not Sonnet 127, Sonnet 126, which ends the young man section. The last sonnet in the young man section, sorry about that, is a poem of only 12 lines. And Shakespeare possibly was trying to signal through this curtailment of the number of lines that this was a point of break in the sequence. And from Sonnet 127, we have another series of sonnets where the person that is described or addressed is no longer the young man, but a lady, dark because she's dark complexioned, but also perhaps because she is a lady of dark morals, or dark morality. Now, sonnets 127 to 152 are about the Dark Lady, but sonnets 153 and 154, the last two sonnets in the sequence, are not really Dark Lady sonnets. Some scholars rather casually divide the sequence into two, I won't say halves, into two sections. The first 126 sonnets, which are about the young man, which address the young man. Some of the poems in this section address the young man directly, others describe him. And then sonnets 127 to 154, they say, but that is wrong. Sonnets 127 to 154 are not about the Dark Lady. It's only sonnets 127 to 152. Of course, yes, the speaker in this sequence has two loves, the young man and the Dark Lady. But there are other characters too. For example, there's a rival poet who is our poet's rival. There have been conjectures about who this person could be. Some say that he could be Christopher Marlowe, some would say Ben Jonson, and other names also have been proposed. But then again, these are conjectures and I choose not to go into that. We have no evidence. We have no evidence. Now, yes, so the poet has two loves. There's a rival poet who at one point is drawing the young man away from our poet. if you read Sonnet 87, for example, Sonnet 87, you find that our poet is lamenting the going away of the young man from him to this rival poet. And very cynically, he says that he was never worthy of the greatness of the young man. And so it's only appropriate that the young man should go away. But then after that, there's a reconciliation between our poet and the young man. And that reconciliation is what Sonnet 116 celebrates. And the idea is that the reconciliation has taken place because the love that exists between the poet and the young man is true love. And Sonnet 116 is an attempt to define true love and to mark true love as different from love as casually understood. All right, we'll talk about that when we talk about Sonnet 116. Now, Sonnets 153 and 154, I'll briefly talk about these two sonnets. They are called Anacriontics, A-N-A-C-R-E, and this is for the sake of the students, A-N-A-C-R-E-O-N-T-I-C-S, Anacriontics, A-N-A-C-R-E-O-N-T-I-C-S. Now, what were Anacriontics? A literary mode dealing with hedonistic desires. Hedonism is a philosophy. Eat, drink, and be merry. That's hedonism. Now, a literary mode which deals with hedonism, which deals with hedonistic desires for love, wine, and music, and is often associated with the theme of carpe diem. You know what that is? Seize the day, make the best of today, make the most of today, because today will not last forever. Now, these poems are called Anacriontics. It's a literary kind, a literary mode. And these poems are called Anacriontics because they were written in imitation of the Greek poet Anacreon, A-N-A-C-R-E-O-N. But sonnets 153 and 154 are also a sort of tribute to Edmund Spenser, because in Spenser's sequence of poems called Amoretti, there were 89 sonnets, but there was also a series of Anacriontics. And the fact that Shakespeare should write two Anacriontics, which here, of course, are also sonnets, suggests that he was trying to follow the pattern set by Spenser. Now, Spenser's Amoretti, besides having 89 sonnets and a series of short poems, not all of them sonnets in the case of Spenser, which we call Anacriontics, also included Epithalamion, a poem about marriage, a poem that celebrates marriage. So Spenser's Amoretti had a three-part structure: a sequence of 89 sonnets describing or addressed to Elizabeth Boyle, and then a series of short poems that we describe as Anacriontics, and Epithalamion, a rather longish poem celebrating marriage. And in imitation of that structure, Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets. And the Anacriotics here are both sonnets included in that sequence of 154, unlike Spenser, where the Anacriontics are cut off from the 89 sonnets. So here we have two Anacriontics within the 154 sonnets. And then, as with Spenser, where we have Epithalamion, a long poem, here also we have a lover's complaint, a long narrative poem. Now, these three are, yes, love sonnets, Anacriontics, and a lover's complaint. Now, these three kinds of poems, of course, I repeat that the Anacriontics in Shakespeare are also sonnets. Now, these were published together by a publisher called Thomas Thorpe, T-H-O-M-A-S, Thomas Thorpe, T-H-O-R-P-E, Thomas Thorpe, as part of the 1609 quarto edition of Shakespeare's sonnets. So All these were within a single cover in the form of a single book. The 1609 quarter of Shakespeare's sonnets, therefore, didn't have only the 154 sonnets. There was also this long poem that Shakespeare wrote. All right, so much then for the background to the sonnets. But the sonnets, mind you, were also later published in octavio format. The quarter format was one where a big parchment was folded twice, once like this and then again like this, so that you had, when you opened it, you had four parts. If you fold a newspaper twice over and then open it up again, you have four parts. And if you tear off the four parts or cut the four parts with a pair of scissors and staple them together, you have four sheets. All right? So that's quarter. Quarter means four. The same newspaper, if you fold it only once and then open it, you have two parts. And if you cut through the paper with a pair of scissors and then staple the two parts, you have two sheets. And these two sheets will be bigger than each of the four sheets in the quarter. The quarter editions were therefore small, the folio sheets were bigger. For the complete works of Shakespeare, the first folio of 1623, we required bigger pages. And so it's a folio. For single text editions, quarter-sized pages worked. And so for the single texts that were published before the first folio, there were these quarto editions. And this edition of the sonnets was also a quarto edition, the 1609 edition. But there were octavio editions as well that were published after that, which meant that you folded the paper 4 times and then opened them to have 8 divisions. And this meant that these octavio books were very small, so that people, young men particularly, could put these books into their coat pockets and walk around. And these were love poems. And that is why they were designed to be put into pockets, so that any time a young man or a woman met a person of the opposite sex and fell in love on the street or in a public gathering or in a ball, as in the case of Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo falls in love with Juliet at first sight, the person carrying the octavio edition of the sonnets could take the book out of the pocket and then read a poem of love out to the person that he or she felt attracted to. All right, so here we go. The first 17 sonnets are generally referred to as Procreation Sonnets, because they ask the young man to procreate, to marry, and produce children. But why? So that the beauty of the young man could be preserved in his children, and then in his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren, and then down the line of descendants. So that the beauty of the young man, which the poet celebrates and glorifies, should not be lost from this world, should not be lost to future generations, so that it survives in the appearances of his descendants. Children or sons here means descendants, and not just the immediate child or the son. But this, of course, is not biologically always possible. The son may not resemble the father, but we can grant our poet here a bit of poetic license and allow him to assume that a son born to the young man will inherit his beauty, and sons born after that will all inherit their father's beauty. And so the beauty that lies upon the face of the young man now would survive on the faces of his descendants, in spite of the inevitable physical death of the young man when he grows older. Look at what the first sonnet says. I'll read bits and pieces from the sonnets that precede Sonnet 18 before I come to Sonnet 18. The first sonnet in the sequence sets the tone. It sets the tone for the theme of procreation. From fairest creatures we desire increase. From the most beautiful creatures, what we desire is that their numbers should multiply, that they should produce offsprings. It could be a peacock, it could be a tiger. Why do we make such efforts for the conservation of tigers? Not only because the tiger is the national animal, that's of course different, but because the tiger is so beautiful. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. Beauty's rose, the essence of beauty, should never die. But as the riper should by time decease. But since the person who grows ripe in years, who grows old, should necessarily die, his tender heir, his tender child, descendant, might bear his memory. Look at Sonnet 2. These were the first 4 lines of the first sonnet of the sequence. Now we come to the second sonnet of the sequence. And he tells the young man, when 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held. When you shall turn 40, when you shall turn 40, there will be wrinkles here on your forehead, on your brow. Brow means the forehead, not the eyebrow, the brow. So the image is from a battlefield, one army besieging the enemy camp and the digging of trenches on the battlefield. So when 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, when the effects of 40 winters, the wrinkles shall invade your forehead and dig trenches there in thy beauty's field, like the battlefield where the soldiers dig trenches. The beauty's field is the face, the forehead. There will be wrinkles all over the face, all over the face. I've seen old people. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, the handsome look of your present youthfulness, so gazed on now, which people look at and admire, will be a tattered weed of small worth held. It will then be like a weed in a garden, which people want to uproot and throw away, which is worthless. That is how you will become. And then if people ask you where all your beauty has gone, where all the treasure of your present youthfulness has disappeared, if in reply to such a question you were to say that it lies in your deep sunken eyes, that beauty which you once possessed and which was so visible now lies deep in the sockets of your sunken eyes, if you said that, that would be so disgraceful, such a shame. Your present beauty deserves greater praise, even in the times to come, even when you grow old. But how is that possible? It's possible only if you had a child, and you could then point towards the child and say, in reply to such a question, this beautiful child of mine is the answer to your question, shall be the answer. All right? And by his beauty, he has proved, you could say, that the beauty that I possessed once and which I have now lost has been passed on to him by the law of succession or by the law of inheritance. And your beauty, therefore, the poet says in the couplet, has to be new made. It has to be refashioned when you grow old. And looking at your child then, you could see in him the warm blood of youth which now flows through your veins. You will then, when you grow old, you will be feeling your blood cold, but you will be able to see it warm in your young child. This is the argument of Sonnet 2. I'll read it very quickly. Then being asked, I'm reading it from the second quatrain, then being asked where all thy beauty lies, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, to say within thine own deep sunken eyes were an all-eating shame and thriftless praise. How much more praise deserved thy beauty's use, if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse, proving his beauty by succession thine. This were to be new made when thou art old, and see thy blood warm when thou feel'st it cold. Of course, I won't be reading sections from all the sonnets that come before Sonnet 18, but just a few of them. Sonnet 3, where the poet asks the young man to look in a mirror and to tell the face that he sees there, which of course would be his own face, that the time has now come for him to form another similar face. How? By marrying and getting a child. Look in thy glass and tell the face thou viewest, now is the time that face should form another. And then to the end of the poem, he tells the young man, you are your mother's mirror. And when your mother, through the windows of her present old age, looks at you, she finds in you the April, that is the beauty. April, of course, is one of the most beautiful months in England, so April. She finds in you the April of her prime. That is when she was in her prime of her lost youth. Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. So thou, through windows of thine age, shalt see, despite of wrinkles, this thy golden time. And so if you marry, when you grow old, in spite of wrinkles, through the windows of your own old age, you would be able to see in your child this present golden time of yours. All right, so let's skip some of these poems here and come to sonnet. Let's get closer to sonnet 18. Let's come to sonnet 16, but I will recommend that you read the sonnets that come between sonnets 3 and 16, which I haven't read for you. Now, in sonnet 16, the poet is responding to a suggestion from the young man, probably from the young man, that the poet should write about him and eternalize the young man's beauty in his verses, rather than asking the young man to marry and to procreate and beget children. An alternative means of eternalizing the young man's beauty has from somewhere been suggested to the poet. Could be from the young man himself, we don't know. And it is to this that sonnet 16 is a response. And he asks the young man, why don't you think of a more mighty way, a stronger way of fortifying your beauty, keeping your beauty protected as in a fort, than with the aid of my rhyme, which is barren, incapable of protecting your beauty. Barren here means incapable. A barren woman, incapable of conceiving and having a child. But wherefore do not you a mightier way make war upon this bloody tyrant time, and fortify yourself in your decay with means more blessed than my barren rhyme? He thinks his rhyme powerless, barren, and asks the young man, but wherefore, that's why, but wherefore do not you a mightier way make war upon this bloody tyrant time, and fortify, protect, and fortify yourself in your decay when you grow older, with means that fortify, protect your beauty, preserve your beauty when you grow older, with means more blessed, that is through procreation, with means more blessed, more capable than my barren rhyme. And then he goes on to tell the young man that you are in the prime of your youth now. Now stand you on the top of happy hours, and many maiden gardens yet unset with virtuous wish would bear your living flowers, much liker than your painted counterfeit. If a painter were to paint you, paint a portrait of yours, and think of preserving your beauty eternally in that portrait, or if I were to write about your beauty, what I write and the kind of picture that emerges from the way I would describe you, or the painting by the painter, these would be counterfeits, not the real person. But a living child with blood running through his veins would be a real person, all right, and would be closer to you in terms of resemblance than a painting or a description in verse. Now he says, now stand you on the top of happy hours and many maiden gardens, young maidens, who are like gardens where flowers would bloom, would bear your loving flowers, your living flowers, your children. They would be willing to be impregnated by you and give birth to your child. And you could choose any one of them. All right? With virtuous wish. He's, of course, he is not talking of illicit relationships. With virtuous wish. There are many maidens willing to marry you, and there is virtue in marriage. He's not talking of illegitimate sexual relationships. So virtuous wish would bear your living flowers much liker, closer to you in terms of resemblance than your painted counterfeit. And then in Sonnet 17, and this is the first time that he's, the second time in the sequence, not the first time, that he's talking about his rhyme. Earlier in the couplet of Sonnet 15, he had briefly mentioned writing poems about the young man. But now this is important. In Sonnet 16, we understand that he's considering his rhyme to be powerless. In Sonnet 17, he doesn't say that his rhyme is powerless. He says that he will write poems describing the young man's beauty. This is what he had said in the closing lines of Sonnet 15 as well. He had said, as he is time, as this is the last line of Sonnet 15, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. What time takes away from you, I engraft you, I plant in you new. Engraft is a word taken over from gardening. You know what's grafting? Drafting is one of the techniques of gardening by which you allow a plant to grow further. What he had meant there is that he would be writing about the young man, and so in writing, in his verses, he would preserve whatever time would take away from him. But then in the next sonnet, he goes back to the older idea of procreation, saying that his verse is incapable of eternalizing the young man. Now, in Sonnet 17, this is important for you because this comes immediately before the sonnet in your syllabus. He says that he will write poems about the young man, describe the young man's beauty as capably as possible. But people would not believe him. People would not believe him because they would think, people of future generations, they would think that no human person could have been so beautiful, wouldn't have been as beautiful as described in the poet's poetry. And they would think that these were lies uttered by an old poet. Old men speak a lot, but very little of what they speak is actually true. This is a satire on old men, old people. And this is what the poet says here. His lines of verse would then be taken to be the untruthful utterances of an old man. But of course, there's a suggestion of Plato here, and Plato's idea of poets being liars. And this is how and so he goes on to say towards the end that people would believe my verse, they will believe my verse only if there were a child of yours present at that time. Some descendant, your son, grandson, great-grandson, anyone, who would be, by his own beauty, which he would have inherited from you, who would be able to substantiate and prove correct my description of your beauty. This is how the poem goes. Who will believe my verse in time to come if it were filled with your most high deserts? Deserts means praises. Though yet heaven knows it is but as a tomb which hides your life and shows not half your parts. On a tombstone, there will be inscriptions about the person who lies buried in the grave. And these inscriptions show only a part of his life, a small fragment of his life. My sonnets about you would be like that. They would be showing only a little part of your beauty, not your entire beauty, because I would not be able to do that. And yet, whatever little I shall be saying will not be believed by people. If I could write the beauty of your eyes, and in fresh numbers, that's fresh poems, number all your graces, make a catalogue of your beautiful features, as Petrarchan sonnetiers used to do, the age to come would say, this poet lies. Such heavenly touches ne'er touched earthly faces. So should my papers on which I would be writing, yellowed with their age, be scorned, like old men of less truth than tongue, and your true rights be termed a poet's rage and stretched meter of an antique song. And your true rights, that is, you have a right to be considered beautiful and handsome. But when I try to establish that, people would think that this was a poet's madness, a poet's rage. Of course, there are allusions here to Plato, who had said that poets were of unsound mind and were liars when they were writing. But were some child of yours, this is the couplet, but were some child of yours alive that time, you should live twice. In it, that's in your child, and in my rhyme.
We are facing some technical glitch. Please stay with us.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, you are audible. Yes, sir. Please continue.
Yes. There was a disruption, sorry.
Yes.
Now we come to Sonnet 18 finally. Now I think I'm going to take up a little more than an hour, so another 20 minutes. Now I'll be talking about Sonnets 18 and 116 surely, but I think this background is necessary. This is something that students tend to ignore. Now Sonnet 18 doesn't talk of procreation at all. Here the poet seems to have discovered confidence in the power of his poetry. He begins by wondering whether he should compare the young man's beauty to the beauty of a summer's day, an English summer's day, which is, of course, very beautiful. Summer is very beautiful in England. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Now, day, I don't think it is a day of 24 hours that the speaker is talking about. I think it's the summer season. It's a case of synecdoche, one of the figures of speech that students study, where the season is talked of as day. It's a case where a less comprehensive term is used as substitute for a more comprehensive term, the season. I'll tell you why. The poet speaks of the brevity of a summer's day, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Now, if it were a summer's day, a single summer's day, it's not brief. It's longer than a winter's day. And particularly in England, in summer, you have sunshine till 9:30 in the night. The sun sets around 10 in summer. So by no means is a summer's day, a single day, very short. But the summer season is the period lent out on lease to summer by the year. It's a term from legal matters, term from law. That is short. That is short. Remember the expression summer seeming lust in Macbeth. It's in the scene where Macduff is conversing with Malcolm and requesting him to become the next king. Summer seeming lust, sexual desire, carnal desire, which is very momentary, very brief. Summer is like that, the summer season. Here also the poet says, summer's lease hath all too short a date. So I would say that day here means the season. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. No sooner has he proposed the possibility of such a comparison than he rejects it on the ground that the young man's beauty is more balanced, more temperate, more toned down than a summer's day. The summer season suffers from extremes. Sometimes there is bright sunshine, sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and sometimes the sky is darkened by clouds. In England, you have overcast skies for the major part of the year. And often, so that is more frequent. Sometimes the sun shines, but often is his gold complexion, the golden color of the sun, dimmed, darkened by enveloping clouds. And then he goes on. This is the first quatrain. In the second quatrain, he says, the second quatrain begins here. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. Now there are three uses of fair here. The first is in the seventh line, and every fair from fair, again in the seventh line, and then again in the 10th line. I'll come to that. And every fair from fair, that's each time the word fair, and Shakespeare was very fond of punning, using puns, using the same word with different meanings. The first fair means every beautiful object, everything of beauty, from fair, from its condition of beauty. Sometime declines, sometime or the other, there will be a fall from beauty. Every beautiful object will lose its beauty. Remember Keats and his Ode to a Nightingale, where he talks of the luster in the eyes of beautiful women. Beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes. A beautiful woman cannot retain for very long the luster, the shine in her eyes. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance, either by accident. A flower, there could be a storm and a beautiful flower could fall off the branch, or it could be torn off by a mischievous young kid, or be the beautiful leaves of a tree could be destroyed by a grazing goat. All right, so those are accidents. But otherwise, if the flowers are not plucked or somehow torn off the branches, they would, with time, wither and die and fall off. So either by accident, by chance, or nature's changing course. If you follow nature's course, nature's path, things will change. Creatures will grow old and die. Flowers will wither on the branches of trees. People will grow old and die. That is if nature's course is left untrimmed. If you don't try to make your own interventions. If you don't interfere with nature's changing course. What the poet is seeking to do is he's trying to trim nature's course by writing his poems about the young man. He's trying to make a poetic intervention into nature's course, to arrest the beauty of the young man. Of course, he will grow old and die, but in another way, the beauty will be held back for future generations to understand and appreciate. So, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. Now, while traditionally poetry considers the realm of nature to be eternal, the cosmos, the sun, all right, the universe is eternal. Traditionally, poetry considers the eternity, accepts the eternity of the universe, the cosmos, but it also accepts the transitoriness of creatures in the universe, plants and animals, human beings, all right? So human beings, let's talk of human beings, are transitory within the eternal cosmos. And Shakespeare begins this poem by suggesting the short life of a season. Summer's lease hath all too short a date. That sets the tone for the later suggestions of mortality. Every fair from fair sometime declines. And the summer season is one of these fair things. So would the young man. So the talk of the brevity of the summer season sets the tone. And then, in spite of this, Shakespeare imbues the young man with a very strange kind of beauty that may be eternalized by the poet's efforts. Now, this beauty is not the summer that lasts for only a short while. This beauty is metaphorically eternal summer. So in spite of the fact that the poet is, at the start of the poem, refusing to compare the young man's beauty to the summer season, there is another kind of summer with which he does compare the young man's beauty. When he says at the start of the 9th line, the 3rd quatrain, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. So there is a comparison. But it's a metaphor, thy eternal summer means your beauty is like summer. But this summer is not the summer in the natural world. The summer in the natural world is something that the poet will not compare the young man's beauty with. Why? Because the young man's beauty, he says, is more lovely and more temperate. But there's a deeper reason for his refusal to make that comparison. And what is that deeper reason? The deeper reason is that the summer of the real, physical, natural world is brief. And the poet's effort in this poem is to resist the mortality of the young man's beauty. And if that is what he's seeking to do, why on earth would he compare the beauty that he is trying to eternalize with something that is so short-lived, which has all too short a date? But then the idea of summer, metaphorical summer, that is eternal. Where metaphorically summer is simply beauty. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. Your beauty, that's the eternal summer. The summer of the mind, the summer that's conceptualized, made in the mind, understood. That is eternal. And the young man's beauty is that eternal summer. And so it cannot fade, it shall not fade. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. And to owe, O-W-E, is to be in debt. I owe him money, means I have to pay him some money. But to owe during the Renaissance also meant to own something, to be the owner of something. If you excuse me for a moment, my laptop is running low on battery charge. I'll plug in the charger. If you just excuse me for a moment. All right, so, but thy eternal summer, now to owe, yes. To owe also meant during Shakespeare's time, not any longer now. But in Shakespeare's time, it did mean to be in debt, but it also meant to own something, to be the owner of something. So you shall not lose your possession of what you own. And what is that? Your beauty. You will possess it forever. Again, a term from law, losing possession of property. All right, the image is from law. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. The death is imagined here as a tyrannical monster who brags and boasts that people walk in his shade, who boasts that he can take people away from the world and pull them towards himself. But in the young man's case, death shall not be able to brag like that. Nor shall death brag, thou wanderest in his shade, when in the eternal lines of my poetry, you grow with time. Eternal lines could also mean the lines, the shape, the contours of the young man's body, the beauty of which will be eternalized in the lines of the poet's verse. So he's again punning on lines. And this brings us to the couplet. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Now, normally this is taken to mean that the poet is now supremely confident of the power of his poetry to eternalize his subject. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long as people live, so long lives this, my poem, or my poems, and this gives life to thee. It's almost a guarantee that the young man will be eternalized in the lines of the poet's verses. But I don't think this is so. I don't think. No, this is of course the general assumption, but I would beg to differ, and I would focus on the first two words of each of the lines in the couplet. So long. It's anaphora. That's another figure of speech where the first couple of words are repeated at the start of successive lines. So this is an anaphoric usage of so long, sometimes called epanaphora. Now, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see. When you say so long, you are setting a point of termination, only as far as this, not beyond that. And it's like a boundary wall. Or the Lakshman Rekha in the Ramayana. Sita was asked not to go beyond that. All right, so long. And this resists the idea of eternity or of eternalization. How does it fit in with the poet's attempt to eternalize the young man? If he's saying, so long as men, it depends on how you read the lines. If you read the lines like this, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this. Obviously, the meaning changes. Now, what I'll say is that the poet will try very hard, but of course, he realizes that he is up against time. He's waging a war against time, and that is not easy. That is not easy at all. So there's no guarantee that the young man will be eternalized in the poet's poetry. Why? Because it depends on certain conditions. First of all, there have to be people living in this world. If human life becomes extinct and the poetry survives, then, of course, the young man will not be eternalized. It's only if people read the poems, then with each reading, the young man's beauty will retain its life and will be eternalized through successive readings. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see. Now, suppose there are men and women, people, human beings, living in this world. They have not become extinct, so that never happens. And the poems also exist, but there is no one, not a single human being, willing to read the poems. Even then, if there are no eyes to see the poems, no eyes to read the poems, even then the young man will not be eternalized. And now suppose there are people living, they are willing to read what the poet has written, but the poems have been lost. They cannot be recovered. Now what happens? Even then the young man will not be eternalized. So there has to be life, human life. There has to be the willingness, the desire to read, and the poems have to exist. These are the three conditions on which the successful eternalization of the young man's beauty by the poet depends. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So long lives this, but then the poems may be lost as well. So it's a case of the, the power of poetry to eternalize its subject is an old concept. Shakespeare was an experimentalist. He was always experimenting. He was experimenting with the genre of the sonnet itself, the possibilities of the sonnet. I've not gone into that in this lecture. That could be the subject of a different lecture. All right? It's something that we talk about, how Shakespeare's sonnets are unconventional. Now, when we talk about that, we don't generally talk about the couplets, and particularly in a sonnet like Sonnet 18, where Shakespeare is offering us a variation of the assumption that poetry is capable of eternalizing its subject. The fact that this capability is dependent on certain conditions is what the poet is stressing here. Now, this is not the only poem in the sequence where the poet talks about the conditions on which his attempts to eternalize the poet's beauty would depend. In several of the poems that follow Sonnet 18, right into the portion of the sequence where we have sonnets 55, 60, 65, the poet is talking about eternalizing the young man's beauty in his poetry, even in those sonnets. Even in those sonnets. But in some of those later sonnets as well, we have this awareness. Sorry, there's a phone call. Hello. চন্দ্রবাবু একটু পরে ফোন করো, ওয়েবিনারে লেকচার হচ্ছে। হ্যাঁ, sure, sure. So yes, there is this possibility of the poet seems to be aware that there is this possibility of that not quite happening, this eternalization not taking place because of these conditions, because of the possibility of life, human life, becoming extinct at some point, of the poems being lost, of there being no desire left to read the poems. Now, Sonnet 116, to which we now come, I'll be brief because I've taken up a lot of time, but then let's get on with it, is an attempt to define true love. Now, in the sonnet that precedes this sonnet, Sonnet 115, the poet talks about life's accidents, or time's millioned accidents, I'm quoting. But reckoning time, whose millioned accidents creep intwixt vows and change decrees of kings. So many accidents take place, unforeseen incidents, which even change the orders, the decrees of kings. And because of life's millioned accidents, or time's millioned accidents, caused because of or within the flow of time, several things may happen. Separations may take place. Estrangements between friends may take place, as had indeed happened between the poet and the young man. But then reconciliations may also take place. The calm of the sea is restored after a storm. Now, that could happen between friends only if there's true love. If the love is not casual, if it's true, sincere, honest, deep. The poem begins with the poet saying that he never wants to get in the way of a marriage of minds. The poem is about the marriage of minds, true love, not quite so about the union of bodies, which makes it very different from the thrust of the early poems in the sequence where the poet had been talking of procreation, which of course requires a union of bodies. Here it's the marriage of minds, of true minds. True minds, what does that mean? Minds that are true to one another, loyal, faithful. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Let me not be an obstacle to true love. Let me never be that. Why? because true love is so important. I would never choose to be an obstacle to true love because I have understood its worth, its value from what happened in my own life. It's true life between me and my young friend that has brought him back to me. This is why he begins the poem on this note. Of course, this is a reference to the Christian Book of Common Prayer, where at the wedding ceremony of a young couple, the priest would read out from the Christian Book of Common Prayer a line which would say, the marriage of, in the English translation of that would be, the marriage of course, the original would be in Latin, but the English translation would be, the marriage of minds is the strongest of ties, is a strong bonding. The marriage of minds is the strongest of ties. Now, the reference, the allusion is to that. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Now, love is not love. That love is not true love. That's what it means. Love is not love. That love is not real love, true love, which alters, which changes when it alteration finds. Alteration, what does that mean? A scope for change, an opportunity for change. That love is not true love, which changes, which alters when it finds an opportunity for change. Or alteration could also mean a third person who enters into the relationship, an alternative to the original lover. All right? That could also be alteration. A new person who causes the love of the beloved to change direction towards himself or herself. So love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. The remover is this new person who enters into a relationship between two persons. A and B are in love with one another. C comes into the relationship. A begins to move away from B towards C. So C is the alteration or the remover. But alteration, as I said, could also mean a scope, opportunity for change. So if that love is not true love, which bends, which changes direction, which alters, changes. A bend is a word which is used with multiple meanings, another case of punning in the poem. We will see how that happens. The next quatrain, oh no, it is an ever fixed mark which looks on tempests and is never shaken. Oh no, he says, no. True. So, oh no is an emphatic affirmation of what the poet has said in the first quatrain, where he has defined love in negative terms by saying what it is not, rather than by saying what it is. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, etc. The second quatrain, of course, begins by talking of love, by defining true love in positive terms. It is, he says, although it begins with oh no, but that's a reference to the earlier quatrain. It is an ever fixed mark, like a lighthouse, which is always fixed in a place where it's been constructed, that looks on tempests in the sea, that looks upon storms in the sea, but is never shaken. It stays fixed in its position on the shore. But true love is, while it's been compared to a lighthouse or a beacon, it's also like the northern star, the pole star, which is constant. Remember Julius Caesar, where Caesar says, I'm constant as the northern star. Now, it is the star to every wandering bark. When a ship, a vessel, loses direction in the sea and begins to wander here and there in the waters of the ocean, it seeks direction from the northern star. In the old days, that is what navigators used to do. So true love is the star to every wandering bark. Bark is a ship, which in Shakespeare's time would be made out of the barks of trees, whose worths are known. So the worth of the northern star to sailors and navigators is immeasurable, it's priceless, invaluable, unknown, it cannot be measured. Though his height be taken, of course, its height, its distance from the earth can be measured in terms of nautical miles, but its value can never be measured. Now, the lighthouse and the northern star are like true love, which brings together two persons who have been fond of one another but have moved away for some reason. What brings them back later is true love. What brings the ship to the shore and shows it direction is the northern star. True love is like that, like a guiding star. It's like the lighthouse, which looks on tempests. True love looks on tempestuous, stormy, violent moments in a relationship, but it stays permanently fixed. It exists permanently. And so, since that is the case, the persons are brought together once again after that stormy session has passed, after it has blown over. Love's not time's food. We move on to the third quatrain. Though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Now, the fool in Elizabethan England was a person who obeyed, a kind of servant, who obeyed the dictates of the master, but also entertained the master. You have a fool in King Lear, you have Feste in Twelfth Night, Touchstone in As You Like It, and a number of other plays. And there were fools in real life as well. But in spite of the fact that the fool had the license to say certain things for which other people would be punished, he still was a servant. But love is not time's servant. Love is not time's servant. True love can never be subject to the dictates and operations of time. It does not obey the dictates of time. Although physical marks of beauty, such as rosy lips and cheeks, are time's servants and come within the compass. Time is here imagined as a reaper with a bent sickle, all right, or scythe, S-C-Y-T-H, a sickle, mowing down, cutting down blades of corn in a cornfield. Rosy lips and cheeks are like the blades of corn that are cut down by the bent sickle of the reaper. The reaper here is time. A bending sickle could have three different meanings. The bent shape of the sickle, or maybe four different meanings. Bent shape of the sickle, the bent arm, the bent elbow, which brings the sickle down. The elbow bends like this and brings the sickle down. The bent could also mean the sickle, or the sickle which causes change in the appearance of the corn. The blades of corn were standing upright, and they have been now flattened to the ground when they have been cut down by the sickle. So their appearances have changed. The sense in which the word bends had been used earlier, or bends with the remover, that love is not love, it changes. So there's a change in the appearance. It could also simply mean bending the blades of grass, similar to the previous meaning, bending the blades of grass and putting them to the ground. All right, so within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. Love doesn't change. True love doesn't change with the passing component parts of time, such as hours and weeks and days. No, it doesn't change. It stays there. But bears it out, it endures, it survives, even to the edge of doom. Now note here, the edge of doom is something like the couplet of Sonnet 18. He's not saying outright that true love is permanent. He's once again suggesting a point of termination. These are the little complexities, the little nuances in Shakespeare. You don't find this in most of the other sonneteers of Shakespeare's time, but you find this in Shakespeare. That's why he's so great. Apparently, he's saying that true love is eternal. But note this, to the edge of doom. It's like the edge of a cliff, beyond which there's a fall. Now, doomsday may or may not come. It's a belief. It's a religious belief, the idea of doomsday. But the way the line is phrased bears it out even to the edge of doom, suggesting that if at all doomsday comes, true love, all life will be destroyed. So the question of true love surviving when life itself is destroyed won't arise at all. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. If what I've said in these earlier lines be proved to be wrong, if it be proved that I have said things that are wrong, then I will say, and if it is proved in a court of law that what I've said is wrong, the way I have talked about true love is wrong, is erroneous, if that can be proved, then I will say that I have never written anything and that no man has ever loved. That, of course, is not right. We know that the poet has written. It is his poem that we are reading, so it's obvious that he has written. And we know from the history of life, human life, that people have fallen in love. So if people have fallen in love and if the poet has written, then, of course, it's difficult to prove that what he has said about true love is wrong. That's the twisted nature of the argument in the couplet. If this be error and upon me proved, I will say that I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So the funny part of the couplet is that if what the poet has said is proved to be untrue, then he will be making a false declaration. Then only will he be saying something that will be untrue. He'll be saying that he has never written and that no man has ever loved. But that would be wrong. So it's like this. If it is proved that what I have said is wrong, then I will say something that will be wrong. And that's the tricky nature of the couplet. The word writ, a student of mine once asked me, why does the poet say, I never writ instead of I never wrote? A writ, of course, is an archaic version of wrote. It's not written because written is another tense. Wrote, yes. Writ is the substitute for wrote. But he doesn't say wrote here. He says writ because if he says writ, only then can he use it as a pun. A writ petition in a court of law. Now, Shakespeare was very fond of using legal images. He had been prosecuted a number of times. Once he had been imprisoned because he had poached deer, and poaching was illegal. Privately owned deer couldn't be poached or killed, and he had hunted them down and was arrested once. So, and he had to face other trials also in life. So he was familiar with legal terms, and he used these legal terms profusely in his poems and plays. And this is one such usage. But thank you very much. I've gone on for very long. Thank you very much for having given me the time to speak about Shakespeare's sonnets. And thank you for your very patient listening.
First of all, I would like to say, sorry about the fact that it's not possible for me to switch on the video because there is no webcam in my monitor. So sorry about that. And then I would like to thank Dr. Subhajit Sengupta for his wonderful and insightful lecture. There was a lot for the students, I believe, and we can be sure about that from the questions that we have received so far. Some of them are really interesting. We'll get into that. Before we check the questions, I would say quickly like to sum up the lecture. I will quickly like to go through the main points, the major points discussed in this lecture by Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta. So he had to talk about a couple of Shakespearean sonnets. To be more precise, sonnet number 18 and sonnet number 116. And to talk about a couple of sonnet, one has to begin with the genre of sonnet, and that is exactly what Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta does. So he begins with the genre of sonnet, which was a kind of new kind of poetry at the time of Renaissance. And if one has to talk about the genre of sonnet, one has to begin with Petrarch, and again that is exactly what he does. So because he had to briefly talk about Petrarch, he also had to talk about Renaissance humanism, which was not directly related to the Shakespearean sonnets. But if one has to talk about Petrarch, one has to talk about Renaissance humanism. It's unavoidable to some extent. So he talks, but the few things that he discusses, there about Renaissance humanism, those things are very important anyway. So he talks about the essential point about Renaissance humanism, the central position of man in Renaissance humanism, and because of that, character and free will, these things become very important there. For example, if we think about Macbeth, we see Macbeth's choice becomes very important. his choice of action becomes very important there. His character becomes very important there, as opposed to, let's say, Oedipus, for example. Oedipus also committed an error in judgment, but that was out of ignorance, unlike Macbeth, who was, who had full knowledge of what he was doing. And after, briefly going through Renaissance humanism, then he moved on to, sonnet. He had to talk about basic things about sonnet first. You have to contextualize the sonnets of
Excuse me,
Shakespeare.
Shubham. Hello, Shubham.
Yes,
You
yes.
have to excuse me for a couple of minutes because the doorbell has rung downstairs and I have to go down and see who has come.
Sure,
All
sure.
right. So you can go on speaking to to the students, but I'll just take a couple of minutes off and attend to the person who has come.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. No problem. Okay. So after that, after talking about Renaissance humanism, then he suggested a few things to the students which are very important, which he keep repeating in the class. To understand any one piece of, literary text, you have to read other things as well. So he suggested that, to understand one or two, Shakespearean sonnets, one should ideally read other sonnets from the same sonnet sequence as well, and not just other sonnets from the same sonnet sequence. One also should check the sonnets of, let's say, early 16th century and then late 16th century, other, sonnets written by other writers, like, other poets like Spencer, Sidney. And if you go through this process, then it helps you in contextualizing your text. So these are very, valuable suggestions given by him to the students. And after that, um, he focuses on the sonnet sequence in question of Shakespeare. Okay, so there are quite a few things about the sonnet sequence about which we are not sure. We cannot be sure. For example, first he says that the speaker of this sonnet sequence should not be confused with Shakespeare himself. Okay, and this is something very basic, but this point has become all the more important after the theoretical developments of the 20th century, as we know, because one has to know very well that when one reads literature, the goal of interpretation should not be an understanding of the intention of the author, but the meaning that comes up from the text itself. Okay, so it is very important for a reader to dissociate the writer from the text. And then he also says that, similarly, we cannot be sure about the identity of Mr. WH, and we also do not know much about the Dark Lady. So there are a few things, there are very few very important things about which we do not have very clear idea, and therefore we have to focus on the text. Okay, and then he focuses on the structure of sonnet. And he says that, just because someone writes a poem of 14 lines, that does not make it a sonnet. There has to be, you have to, include other features as well. And he begins by analyzing the structure of Petrarchan sonnet, where we have an octave, an estate, and there's another, part of it which many people often miss, that is the volta. Okay, it is included in those two divisions because the volta occurs at the end of the octave and at the beginning of the sestet. So volta refers to the change, the turn. And then he also discusses the rhyme scheme of Petrarchan sonnet, which goes like A B B A, and then D D E C D, or C D C C D C. And after that, he focuses on the Shakespearean sonnet structure, where the rhyme scheme is A B A B C D C D E F E F G G, and therefore we have, unlike the Petrarchan sonnet, we have three quatrains and a final couplet. And therefore the arguments also, had to develop in four stages in Shakespearean sonnets, unlike that of the Petrarchan sonnet. So here he also points to the fact that there has to be relation between the content and the structure of a literary text, right? And then there are other divisions as well. He also discusses other structural points. For example, um, the first part of Shakespearean sonnet sequence uh, goes from sonnet 1 to sonnet 126, which is dedicated to Mr. WH, and then the rest of it is dedicated to the Dark Lady. Now, the two sonnets in questions which he wanted to focus on, those sonnets belong to the first part only, and therefore he would focus on the first part, uh, the first part of the structure, the sonnets dedicated to Mr. WH. And then after that, he focuses on the two sonnets, and he presents a kind of close reading of the two sonnets. And it's very difficult to summarize a close reading like that, where he comments on every line, every word. um, so I think this is all that I would like to say about the lecture. Beyond that, it's not possible to summarize. Now we have a lot of questions. As I said a few minutes ago, I would like to focus on the questions, present the questions, and pass them on to Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta. Just a minute. Sir, are you there? I think we have to wait for a couple of minutes for him to join.
Hello.
Yeah. So now
I'm
I
very
would like
sorry.
to
I stay alone in the quarters here in Burdwan. And so if the doorbell rings, there is no one else to open the door except me.
Yeah, it's fine. So we are done with the sum up portion, and now we'd like to pass the questions to you.
Okay.
So let me go through the questions. So the first question comes from Shushanto Koyal, and it goes like this: Sir, what might be the reason behind introducing a unique type of poetry form consisting of 14 lines at that time in Italy? Or was it just a coincidence where poets like Petrarch or Dante accidentally wrote this particular type of 14 lines poem?
Well, that's a good question, Shushanta, but honestly, I don't know the reason. And no one has left any document behind stating the reason for the birth of this kind of poetry and the growth in popularity of the sonnet. So, whatever may be said about the reason why this kind of poetry was introduced to readers and to the world would be again on the basis of conjecture, and I don't believe in conjectures. So, uh, perhaps simply assume and not assume something about the reason of its uh, origin and not go too deep into that because there's no evidence that what we might assume to be the reason for the origin could be the correct reason. I would say that these were love poems, essentially love poems, short poems that spoke of not just love, but about all the subtle relationships, the fluctuations, the passing emotions, and the torments, the pangs, and the gratifications that are part of the experience of being in love. And therefore, I would say that the writers of these sonnets possibly felt that the, the, the brevity of these poems, the compact nature of these poems, and the way the rhyme scheme could facilitate certain patterns and structures of arguments, be the argument twofold, as in the Petrarchan model, or be it in four parts, as in the Shakespearean model. Um, that perhaps was an appropriate vehicle for articulating love, which is why in a play like Romeo and Juliet, you have sonnets. It's basically a play about youthful love. The poem begins with a sonnet. There's a sonnet at the beginning of the second act. And even in the conversations that Romeo and Juliet have, you find disguised sonnets. You have a line spoken by Romeo, another spoken by Juliet, again by Romeo. And if you take a section of 14 lines, at certain points in the play, not everywhere, you'll find that you have a sonnet. 3 quatrains, a couplet, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. But here you have 2 speakers, lines spoken alternately by Romeo and Juliet. You have a play like Love's Labour's Lost, another play by Shakespeare, where in fact sonneteering becomes a theme. It's one of the themes of that play. So the sonnet, the form of this kind of poetry, it's something that agreed with the nature of love, particularly youthful love. Yes, that's all that I would say.
Thank you. Now you check the next question. Okay, this is from Konkona Mahapatro. She says the traditional eternal triangle become in this sequence a kind of perverted parallelogram. What is the meaning of perverted parallelogram?
I don't think that I'm very confident about answering that question, Konkona, because I really don't have much of an idea. Excuse my ignorance, but I really don't have much of an idea of what perverted parallelogram is. And if you ask me, Konkona, I would simply love to enjoy the sonnets rather than go into the meaning of perverted parallelogram. I might go into its meaning at a time when I'm not enjoying the sonnets. But then if you search for the meaning of perverted parallelogram, you lose the joy of reading Shakespeare's sonnets. Or if you search for meanings of these terms like perverted parallelogram, I'm not saying that you should remain ignorant of the meanings of these terms, but I think that sometimes we tend to dissect the sonnets or any literary work so much, particularly with modern literary critical theory and cultural theory coming in. That's necessary, but one sometimes overdoes it. And perverted parallelogram is well, I'll find out about it. I don't know the meaning right now, but I'm sure that I can lead a very happy life without knowing its meaning. But then that, of course, is not the answer to your question. I will try to find the meaning. Thank you for having made me aware of this. I'm sorry about not being able to answer your question. Now, before I take the next question, I'll just say 2 things, if you excuse me. First, I spoke about Renaissance humanism, and there was a reason behind that, which I forgot to mention later in the course of the lecture. Now, when the young man is being asked to marry and produce children, now the poet is asking the young man to do this. Why is he asking the young man to do this? Because he knows that the young man is capable of thinking over this proposal offered by the poet, thinking it over in his mind and then taking a decision. And this is where the celebration of man, the celebration of man's power to think and take decisions comes in. All right? And I had intended to say this, but I forgot. And the other thing that I forgot to say in the course of the lecture is that Sonnet 18 and a few other sonnets in Shakespeare's sequence are examples of combination of the Petrarchan model and the English model, which was invented by Henry Howard, which is sometimes referred to as the Shakespearean model, the Shakespearean sonnet. It's a hybrid, because although we have the rhyme scheme of the traditional Shakespearean sonnet, if you look at Sonnet 18, it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, and G, G. But if you look at the development of the argument, it proceeds in 2 sections. The first 2 quatrains being the equivalent of the octave of the Petrarchan sonnet, and the 3rd quatrain and the couplet being the equivalent of the sestet. And the 3rd quatrain begins with a Volta, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. The first part talks about summer's day, and gives us a list of reasons why the young man should not be compared to the summer's day. Summer's leaseth all too short a day, sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, etc., etc. And then, but the eternal summer shall not fade. Now he's talking of eternalizing the young man's beauty. Now, look at Sonnet 116. There, in contrast to this, the argument develops in 4 stages across 3 quatrains and a couplet. If you look at that poem carefully, you will realize this difference between the structure of the argument in Sonnet 18 on the one hand and Sonnet 116 on the other. All right, maybe move on to the next question. Sorry, Konkona, once again, I apologize.
Yeah, thank you. What you said about Renaissance humanism, those points were valuable anyway, but now that you connect that to the poems, it becomes all the more interesting. And secondly, right, yes, this is one poem. Sonnet 18 is one sonnet which combines the 2 structures of the Shakespearean sonnet and the Petrarchan sonnet. Right, thank you. So the next question, it comes
not
from
the 2 structures. It combines the rhyme scheme of the Shakespearean sonnet with the structure of the argument of the Petrarchan sonnet.
Right.
That's what
right.
I meant.
Yes, thank you. So the next question comes from Shomili Hajra. Sir, as we have known so far that the 126 sonnets were dedicated to the unknown WH, while we are not quite sure about whom these sonnets focus on, by this can we sense the sense of narcissism in it?
No, narcissism is a case of a person being in love with himself, with his own appearance. A person who looks at himself or herself very frequently in a mirror, for example, would be a narcissist. These poems, I'm not sure why you sense narcissism in the sonnets, because it's obvious that the speaker is not speaking of his own beauty, he's speaking of the beauty of another person, the young man. The young man may be WH or may not be WH. And of course, when you say we have known so far that the 126 sonnets were dedicated to that's wrong. It's not the 126 sonnets, it's the entire sequence of 154 sonnets that are dedicated to WH. Of course, it's unknown who WH was. There have been a few conjectures. I've spoken about some of them to you in the course of the lecture. Now, the first 126 sonnets, dedicated is the wrong word to use here. They are sonnets that either address directly or describe a young man who is very handsome. And this young man may be WH or may not be WH. I personally don't think that we should identify the young man with WH because there is no reason why we should. All right?
Yes.
While we're not quite sure about whom the sonnets focus on, of course, they focus on a young man, they focus on a dark lady, and there's a rival poet. Now, to try and find out who this young man is, who the dark lady is, or who the rival poet was, is to take for granted that the sonnets are autobiographical. But that's something we are not sure of. There's no evidence. It's been over 400 years now that Shakespeare wrote the sonnets. And 400 years is more than sufficient to determine whether the sonnets are autobiographical or not. And since it has not been proved that the sonnets are autobiographical, I don't think there's any point in trying to seek the identities of the young man and the dark lady. Let's simply accept them as characters created by William Shakespeare. Yes, Ipshita's question.
Yes, right. So, sir, as you said that the identity of the fair youth is unknown and he could be an imaginary character. So, can we interpret it this way that the fair youth is an alter ego of Shakespeare himself?
There's no reason to do that, Ipshita. There's no reason to do that. All right. If I love painting. If I paint a person, a portrait or a full figure, head to toe of a person, if I paint a person on canvas and hang the picture on the wall, even if the person doesn't look like me, the person may look like me or may not look like me. Now, would you come and see the painting and say that, sir, is he your alter ego? Of course, you're free to ask me that question, but I don't think there is any reason why you should.
Yes. I think rather than an interpretation, it is more of an imaginary understanding.
Yes, we shouldn't carry interpretation too far. I mean,
Yeah, right.
there is nothing in Shakespeare's sonnets where he talks about the fair youth to suggest. I have discovered nothing, honestly, which would suggest that the fair youth is an alter ego of Shakespeare.
Yes, it's not a logical deduction that deduction from the material we have at hand, but as I said,
But
more of
thank you
an
for the
image.
question. It's
Yes,
always good to ask questions.
yes. Okay, so let's see what else we have. Uh, yes, there's one from Karima Yasmin. She says, "Sir, is the idea of resemblance in the descendants not very much problematic in the present era? Resemblance not only being expected in terms of beauty but also success."
Well, yes, if Shakespeare had been alive today, or if someone today decides to write poems on procreation and children inheriting something from their parents, then of course I believe that they would not be talking of the inheritance of beauty. They would rather be talking of the inheritance of property and wealth and maybe the drive, the passion, the zeal to be successful. These are things that people generally expect children to inherit today from their parents. If their parents too had been very successful in life, yes, that's true. But um, Shakespeare was not really thinking along those lines, and of course the times were different. And the speaker in these poems is focusing on beauty, is focusing on a kind of relationship, a triangular relationship between beauty, true love, and time. Time may destroy true beauty, but it will not destroy true love. And if there is true love, the two persons will stay together forever. And it's true love for the young man that prompts the poet to try to eternalize his beauty. That is also where true love expresses itself in that desire to eternalize the young man's beauty. So it's a relationship between true love, beauty, and time that the sonnets try to work out. And that's one of several dimensions to the sequence of sonnets that Shakespeare wrote. Robert.
Okay, so that's about it. And thank you once again, sir, for your wonderful presentation.
You're very welcome.
Now,
It was a pleasure.
and now over to Dr. Bashubdatta Ghosh.
Thank you so much, sir. You have taken out this amount of time for our students from your busy schedule. That is we are so grateful to you for that. You are such a busy person. Thank you so much, sir, for giving such insightful thoughts to our students. The way you have dealt with each and every sonnet with such detailed, every line, every word of it, and their detailed implications. I feel our students are very much enriched by your insightful lecture and your answers. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us. And we hope that we will have you again when we will be doing such kind of lecture series for other lectures as well. Thank you so much. Thank you once again on behalf of my entire department for giving your valuable time to us. Thank you, sir. And I would
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, and big thank you to all your colleagues, your wonderful colleagues and wonderful students in the department. And those were very good questions that your students had for me. It was a pleasure speaking to them. And if the discussion that I had with your students could in any way enrich the understanding of your students and inspire them to read Shakespeare's sonnets more critically and perhaps with greater enthusiasm, I'll be a very happy person. Thank you and good night.
I'm very much sure, sir, that your lecture has inspired them to read more. And what you said, that not only reading those texts which are there in your syllabus, but reading the entire sonnet sequence or reading other texts as well. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for being with us. I thank our principal, Dr. Debashish Pal, for supporting us in this endeavor. I thank our head of the department, Mr. Shondip Kumar Dolui, sir, for encouraging us to arrange this kind of web lecture series. I thank all my colleagues for supporting and working so hard to make this a great success. And last but not the least, I thank all my students, all our students, for being patient and for being so enthusiastic about listening to the lecture and asking your valuable questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir, once again. That is all for today. Thank you, everyone, and very good night. Stay safe. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, sir.